You got into bed, lay down, closed your eyes, and then woke up this morning. Somewhere between those two moments, 8 hours vanished completely, not faded or half-remembered, just gone. There is no last conscious thought you can hold on to, no memory of your eyes finally giving in, no recollection of the exact instant you crossed from awake into asleep. You have done this tens of thousands of times across your life, roughly a third of it spent unconscious, and yet the transition itself remains permanently unrecorded. The answer lies in some genuinely strange corners of neuroscience, and once you understand what your brain is doing in those final waking minutes, the mystery only gets weirder. Why your brain stops recording before you're even asleep. Throughout the day, your brain burns energy constantly, and one byproduct of that activity is a chemical called adenosine, which builds up steadily from the moment you wake up like an unpaid tab you cannot close until bedtime. Adenosine actively suppresses the brain's arousal systems, gradually making you feel heavier and foggier the longer you stay awake. This is also why caffeine works. It blocks adenosine receptors, so your brain simply cannot read its own exhaustion signal, rather than supplying any real extra energy. Alongside this chemical buildup, your circadian rhythm, governed by a small region of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, begins dialing down alertness as night approaches, releasing melatonin and dropping body temperature slightly. Eventually, a kind of neurological switch flips. Neurons in the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus actively suppress the brain's wakefulness systems, quieting the norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine signals that normally maintain alertness. Somewhere in this chemical negotiation, something critical happens to your thalamus, and this is where the missing memory starts to make sense. Under normal waking conditions, the thalamus acts as your brain's relay station, routing everything you see, hear, and feel toward the cortex for conscious processing. As you fall asleep, a structure called the reticular thalamic nucleus begins inhibiting the thalamus's relay cells, progressively cutting off that flow of sensory information. Your phone buzzing across the room, a passing car, the hum of an air conditioner, none of it gets forwarded upstairs anymore. Your cortex, the seat of conscious experience and memory formation, gets starved of input, and without input, it cannot form coherent new memories. This alone explains most of the mystery. You cannot remember falling asleep because the process of falling asleep is your brain actively dismantling its own ability to record experience, the encoding machinery shutting down before you are even fully unconscious. It is like filming on a phone whose battery dies mid-recording, the final seconds corrupted or missing entirely, not because nothing happened, but because the recording equipment itself gave out. The strange light show you never remember, but your brain does not simply go quiet. There is a transitional phase called hypnagogia, technically stage 1 sleep, lasting anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, during which the cortex is not fully asleep and the thalamus has not finished closing its gate. In that liminal zone, the brain starts producing spontaneous, involuntary sensory experiences, essentially mild hallucinations. Researchers who wake people during this phase report geometric shapes drifting across vision, sudden flashes of faces or places, a name being called, or a fragment of music, along with the most famous example, the sudden sensation of falling, immediately followed by a violent full-body jerk known as a hypnic jerk, experienced by an estimated 60 to 70% of people. One popular theory suggests the brain misreads the muscle relaxation of sleep onset as an actual loss of balance and fires an emergency correction signal through the motor system, possibly a leftover reflex from ancestors who slept in trees, where sudden relaxation genuinely could mean falling. Whatever the cause, the response is immediate and thoroughly undignified, startling sleeping partners throughout all of recorded history. Critically, almost nobody remembers any of this the next morning, not because it did not happen, but because the brain's memory encoding systems were already shutting down while it occurred. The hippocampus, the structure primarily responsible for converting experience into long-term memory, sits in a transitional state during hypnagogia, and some research suggests this stage is actually associated with increased forgetting rather than memory formation. You genuinely hallucinate, complete with geometric light shows and a dramatic false sensation of plummeting every single night, and you remember none of it. Sleep researchers have studied this directly by waking people at different points during sleep onset and asking what they were experiencing. Early in the hypnagogic phase, people typically report fragmented, disconnected imagery, single isolated images with no narrative thread. A bit deeper in, the reports grow stranger, acquiring more detail and a fleeting sense of place or sound, occasionally hinting at the beginning of a dreamlike structure that dissolves almost immediately once the person is woken and asked to describe it. These hypnagogic experiences are far more fragile than the dreams people sometimes remember from deeper REM sleep later in the night. They exist only in the moment and then evaporate completely, among the least sticky memories the human brain ever produces. This process is not a single clean threshold either. Sleep onset is, according to researchers, a local phenomenon, meaning different regions of the cortex can slip into sleep at different times, while other regions remain briefly active. This is why nodding off somewhere embarrassing, like a lecture or a long meeting, sometimes leaves a vague impression of something happening just before you jolted awake. Your motor cortex perhaps still alert while your prefrontal cortex had already checked out. By the time the brain regions responsible for memory and self-awareness go offline, the regions that would have recorded that transition have typically already stopped working. It is a bit like trying to film yourself falling asleep by holding the camera yourself. Eventually, the hand relaxes, the camera drops, and the final frames capture nothing useful. Why your brain doesn't bother keeping this memory sleep itself is, among other things, a memory consolidation process, selectively strengthening some memories from the day while quietly discarding others, a kind of nightly editing job rather than blanket reinforcement. The hazy, fading experience of falling asleep contains no actionable information and no real survival relevance, so it understandably lands on the cutting room floor virtually every night across the entire species. Meanwhile, the hippocampus shows interesting activity during this transition, possibly tagging and sorting the day's recent memories rather than forming new ones, functioning more like an overnight editor reviewing footage than a camera still rolling, and the act of editing is never itself part of the final film. There is a genuinely strange philosophical layer here too. The fact that you cannot remember falling asleep means a regular nightly gap exists in your subjective experience that you remain completely unaware of, since noticing the absence of consciousness would itself require consciousness. The ancient Greeks seemed to sense something like this intuitively, associating sleep with Hypnos, the twin brother of Thanatos, the god of death, not because sleep was considered dangerous, but because something philosophically unsettling sits inside its nightly suspension of self. You go to sleep, and in some meaningful sense, you stop, and something claiming continuity with you resumes the next morning with no direct memory of the gap. This generally feels fine because you wake up with your memories intact and your personality unchanged, but the feeling of continuity and the actual fact of continuity are not quite the same thing. So why can't you remember falling asleep? Because your brain dismantles its own recording equipment before going fully offline. The thalamus closes the gate on incoming sensory data. The hippocampus shifts away from forming new long-term memories toward nightly maintenance, and the prefrontal cortex, central to self-awareness, is among the first regions to drop offline. By the time all of this unfolds, there is no longer a version of you awake enough to notice it happening. Between your last clear memory and the alarm going off sits an entire unwitnessed event, the closing of the thalamic gate, hypnagogic hallucinations complete with geometry and phantom sounds, probably at least one dramatic hypnic jerk, and a slow, region-by-region cortical shutdown, a full neurological performance with no audience, since the audience and the performer happen to be the same vanishing person. You disappear like this thousands of times across a lifetime and never remember a single instance, trading 8 hours of nightly absence for a restored, functional version of yourself each morning. Given the genuinely bizarre nature of that transition, the hallucinations, the phantom ledge, and the progressive shutdown of your own awareness, it might honestly be for the best that none of it sticks. If this changed how you think about your own nightly disappearing act, hit like on this video, subscribe for more deep dives into the neuroscience of everyday experience, and drop a comment with the strangest hypnagogic moment you can actually remember.